What if I told you the first black millionaire banker in the North started out with $10 and a pushcart of fruit? Not a business degree, not a rich family, and not even a single connection in banking. Just a man who refused to accept that a city could tell him what he wasn't allowed to build. His name was Jesse Binga, and by the 1920s he controlled a bank, an office building, and a fortune worth $1.5 million. Then it all came apart, and the same city that once called him a genius sent him to prison for it. Join us as we break down how he built it, why it collapsed, and why his story still matters today. Chapter 1. The Collapse. Picture Chicago in the summer of 1930. Lines are wrapping around the block on 35th and State. These aren't tourists. They're barbers, cooks, porters, preachers, everyone who ever trusted Jesse Binga with their savings. And every single one of them wants their money back right now. Binga stands in the doorway of the bank he built from nothing, watching a line of his own neighbors turn into something close to a mob. He had spent over 20 years telling these people their money was safe with him, that a black man could run a bank just as well as any white man downtown. For a long time, he was right. Then the Auditor General of the state of Illinois shuts the whole thing down. Just like that, the first black-owned bank in the North becomes the first bank in Chicago to fail in the Great Depression. Thousands of black families lose their savings in a single afternoon. Money they trusted to a man they thought could not fail. The building itself was hard to miss. Grand columns out front, a marble lobby, a name in gold letters above the door. For 2 decades, that building had stood as physical proof that black-owned banking could work in America. On this particular day, it stood as proof of exactly how fast that could all disappear. But here's where things get interesting, because 3 years earlier, this same man had his portrait on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, described as a banker whose word was gold, trusted, and honorable. Booker T. Washington had already called him the most successful Afro-American banker in the entire country. Nobody standing in that line in 1930 was thinking about that quote anymore. They were thinking about rent, about groceries, about money that had simply stopped being theirs. A few of them had walked over from jobs they could not afford to leave. Others had brought their children with them because there was nobody left at home to watch them. So how does a man go from that headline to a jail cell in less than 5 years? That question is really the whole point of this video. Because this isn't just a story about one bank failing. It's a story about how far a black entrepreneur could rise in America before the system found a way to bring him back down, and about a man who decided the risk was worth taking anyway. Keep that in mind as we go through this, because it's going to come up again and again. Binga's rise and Binga's fall were never two separate stories. They were built out of the exact same decisions. Unlike a modern founder who can fail quietly and relaunch under a new name a year later, Binga's failure played out in public, in real time, with his own neighbors standing in line watching every second of it. Chapter 2. The Hustle. To understand how Binga got there, go back to Detroit. He was born on April 10, 1865, the youngest of 10 kids, just 4 days after Lincoln was shot. 10 kids under one roof meant there was never much extra to go around. His father cut hair for a living. His mother, a woman named Adelphia, quietly built her own real estate holdings in Detroit and Rochester, even developing a small row of transitional homes known locally as Binga Rows for formerly enslaved people moving north. Watching her run that operation while raising 10 kids taught Jesse something most children never learn: property leverage. He dropped out of school as a teenager to help her collect rent, and for a short stretch he worked in the office of a black attorney named Thomas Crispus, picking up more about contracts and property than most people his age ever would. That kind of exposure was rare for a black teenager in the 1880s. Most doors into that world simply didn't open. Then he went looking for something bigger. He cut hair in Seattle, then Tacoma, then Oakland, working as a Pullman porter along the way, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Every city was just a stop on the way to something else. Somewhere in there, he bought a piece of land in Pocatello, Idaho, and flipped it for a real profit. That's the first sign this man understood property better than most people around him. He didn't have a mentor teaching him any of this. He was learning it the same way he learned everything else, by doing it, failing at parts of it, and doing it again somewhere new. In 1893, he showed up in Chicago for the World's Fair with $10 to his name. No job waiting, no plan beyond survival. He grabbed a pushcart and started selling fruit to the crowds pouring into the city, working the same corner day after day until people started recognizing his face. This is the actual starting point of a $1.5 million empire. A grown man hustling fruit off a cart on a street corner with no idea what he was about to become. Most people who start this poor never get a real second chance. Binga wasn't looking for a second chance. He was looking for a first one, and Chicago, for all its problems, was the one city willing to give it to him. Chapter 3. The Rise. Here's where things start moving fast, and here's the theme worth holding on to for the rest of this video. Everything Binga built next, he built because no one else would build it for him. He took the little money he made off that cart and leased space in his own rented room near 37th and State. He used the profit to buy up buildings nobody else wanted, fixed them with his own hands, and rented them to the wave of black families arriving in Chicago during what became known as the Great Migration. Thousands of people were leaving the Jim Crow South every year, looking for factory jobs and a little more room to breathe, and most of them landed in the same narrow strip of the South Side that white Chicago had already decided was the only place they were allowed to live. Binga made himself the landlord of that strip before he ever touched a dollar of anyone else's savings. Within a few years, he'd gone from a rented room to a house, then an apartment building, then dozens of flats and storefronts. By 1908, before he'd even opened a bank, he was already landlord to roughly 2,000 tenants. By 1902, he had his own real estate office on State Street. 3 years later, he pulled off something that got the whole neighborhood talking. He leased an entire apartment building at 35th and State, and when the white tenants realized a black landlord now controlled it, they packed up and moved out. In 1908, he married Eudora Johnson, whose brother was a well-known Chicago gambling figure nicknamed Mushmouth. When that brother passed, Eudora came into an inheritance of around $200,000. Stacked on top of what Jesse had already built, that gave him the weight to attempt something no black man in the North had pulled off. That same year, right in the middle of the Panic of 1907, he opened his own bank. It ran privately at first, but by 1921 it had a state charter and a new name, the Binga State Bank, with deposits on opening day already past $200,000. In the entire United States at that time, there were only a small handful of black-owned banks, and almost none of them operated north of the Mason-Dixon line. Binga wasn't just building a business. He was proving a concept the rest of the country assumed couldn't work outside the South. A photograph from that opening day, January 3, 1921, shows Binga standing at the center of the crowd, surrounded by new tellers and well-wishers packed into the lobby. Within 3 years, deposits had climbed past 1.3 million. By 1924, the bank had outgrown its original space and relocated into a new, far more imposing set of offices. He hired black clerks and tellers into jobs almost no other bank in the city would give them, and he pushed something he called the double-duty dollar, the idea that every dollar spent inside the black community should build wealth and pride at the same time. For a young black clerk in 1920s Chicago, walking into that bank every morning to work behind a real teller's window meant more than just a paycheck. It meant proof that the ceiling everyone told them was permanent could actually move. Booker T. Washington called him the most progressive and successful Afro-American banker and real estate broker in the entire country. Not everybody saw him as a hero, though. Some accused him of exploiting white fears just to buy properties cheap and flip them to black families at inflated prices. Others called him a harsh landlord who charged high rents to people who had nowhere else to go. Binga never really argued with that reputation. He saw himself as a businessman first and a community hero second, if at all. This is where the pattern really shows up. Binga wasn't just running a business. He was building the infrastructure a segregated city refused to build for his community, and that decision is exactly what made him a target. Compare that to a white-owned bank of the same era. If a white banker got into trouble, he usually had a network of other white bankers, white regulators, and white investors ready to step in. Binga had none of that. Every dollar of risk he took on alone. And every dollar he lent to someone the rest of the system had already rejected made his own position that much more fragile. The idea itself didn't die with him. A small number of black-owned banks still operate in the United States today, built on that same basic principle: serve the community that mainstream banks are quick to overlook. Binga just happened to be doing it a century early, with no safety net underneath him. Chapter 4: The Bombings. Now, here's where his story takes a dark turn. Success didn't make Binga's life easier. It made him a target. When he moved his family into an all-white neighborhood, his house got bombed, by some counts 6 separate times, part of a wave of 58 racially motivated bombings across the city between 1917 and 1921. His business office got hit twice on top of that. One researcher who spent years digging through old newspapers put it simply: nobody in Chicago got bombed more than Jesse Binga did. Then, in July of 1919, the city exploded into one of the worst race riots in American history, leaving 38 people dead, more than 500 injured, and close to 1,000 people homeless. Chicago's Black Belt, the same strip of the city Binga had helped build, bore the brunt of the destruction. In the aftermath, Binga got a letter from a group calling itself the Headquarters of the White Hands, blaming him personally and warning him, in 5 blunt words, "You know what comes next." Most men would have left, but Binga didn't. He is said to have told people around him simply, "I will not run." He kept his home standing, kept his bank open, and kept expanding like none of it had happened. Police were posted outside his house for a stretch. Reporters started showing up just to see whether the bombers would come back. Binga kept walking into that bank every single morning like it was any other day. The black press covered every single attack in detail, turning Binga into a kind of living symbol. Proof that a black man could build something so big that white Chicago felt the need to try and blow it up. Every headline about another bombing only made his name bigger. And here's what that really shows. In a city that used violence to punish black success, refusing to be intimidated wasn't just personal pride. It was a strategy. Every bomb that failed to move him only raised his standing higher among the families watching from a few blocks away. This wasn't just Binga's problem. Plenty of black entrepreneurs in that era faced the exact same math. Retreat and lose everything you built. Stay and risk losing your life along with it. Binga chose to stay, and for a long time that choice looked like it was paying off. It's the same dynamic that would destroy Black Wall Street in Tulsa just 2 years later. Wealth built by black hands becoming a target simply for existing. Binga's bombings were smaller in scale, but they were built on the exact same logic. Chapter 5: The Fall. By 1929, Binga was at the absolute height of his power. So he built the Binga Arcade, a 5-story office building with a rooftop ballroom and space for black doctors, lawyers, and dentists who could never get office space anywhere else in the city, meant to anchor the neighborhood for another generation. It cost roughly $325,000, and it was supposed to be the crown jewel of everything he had built over 3 decades. It opened right as the stock market crashed. One historian later summed it up as simply the wrong building in the wrong place at the wrong time, leaning on rental income that never showed up. Worse, a huge chunk of Binga's bank was tied up in mortgage loans to black churches and fraternal organizations. Loans he'd personally approved because those institutions had nowhere else in the city to turn for credit. White-owned banks routinely refused to lend to black congregations at all, no matter how solid their finances looked. When the Depression hit, and church members lost their jobs by the thousands, the payments stopped. Binga had a choice: foreclose on churches and lodges in his own community, or hold on and hope. He chose not to foreclose, even as the numbers kept getting worse by the week. These weren't strangers to him. Some of those congregations had been banking with him since the day he opened his doors. Foreclosing on them would have meant personally shutting down the same institutions he had spent 2 decades helping build. Instead, he went looking for outside help, first trying to raise capital for a second bank he wanted to call South Park National. Then turning to the Chicago Clearinghouse Association, an organization he'd paid dues into for over a decade. State officials wanted an extra $400,000 in cash before they'd even consider backing him. His fellow bankers at the clearinghouse turned him down flat. With no help coming, the Auditor General of Illinois shut Binga State Bank down for good in June of 1930. It became known later as Chicago's very first bank closure of the entire Great Depression. This was decades before the phrase "too big to fail" ever existed, but the double standard was already obvious. When white-owned banks ran into trouble, the wider system usually found a way to protect them. When Binga ran into trouble, that same system closed ranks and let him drown. The real tragedy is this: the very same instinct that built his empire, lending to people the rest of the system refused to touch, is the exact thing that destroyed it. That's not a footnote. That's the whole tragedy in one sentence. Binga could have protected himself. He could have foreclosed, called in the loans, and probably kept his own fortune intact while the churches around him lost their buildings. He didn't do that. Whatever else you think of him, that single decision cost him everything he had. Chapter 6. The Verdict. The moment the bank closed, investigators went through Binga's books, and by March of 1931 he was indicted for embezzlement. Some witnesses claimed they had unknowingly signed blank sheets of paper for Binga, sheets he later filled in as mortgages to prop up the bank's books. His first trial, in 1932, ended in a hung jury. Prosecutors came back a second time, arguing he'd shifted money meant for his new bank into his own account, and in 1933 a jury finally found him guilty. The charge involved $22,000. The sentence was 1 to 10 years. Many in Black Chicago saw it as a controversial prosecution, a way to punish a man for the crime of failing in public. Newspapers that once praised him as a genius now covered the trial like a spectacle, printing every detail of the collapse while barely mentioning the decades of work that came before it. Binga was sent to Stateville, one of the toughest maximum security prisons in the country. But the community didn't walk away. More than 10,000 residents, including people who'd lost their own savings, signed a petition asking for his release. Attorney Clarence Darrow and religious leader George Griffin both spoke up on his behalf. Think about that. The very people his collapse hurt still stood up for him, not because they forgot what happened, but because they remembered everything else he had done before it. After 3 years, Binga was paroled and walked straight into a job as a janitor and usher at St. Anselm's Catholic Church. He maintained his innocence until the day he died. In 1941, Illinois Governor Dwight Green reportedly granted him a formal pardon. None of it brought back the fortune. He died in Chicago on June 13, 1950, and his own family couldn't afford to put his name on the headstone at Oakwood Cemetery. Most of the properties he once owned have since been torn down and redeveloped, much of it by the Illinois Institute of Technology. Though the house that got bombed so many times back in 1990 is somehow still standing on the south side today. This is what makes Binga's story still matter today. Long before anyone was talking about black-owned banks as a modern idea, Jesse Binga had already built one, lost it, and paid for it with his freedom. The man who once had his own bank, his own arcade, and his own portrait on the front page of the Chicago Tribune ended up in a grave with no name on it at all. Every time someone brings up the idea of black-owned banking today, as a modern solution, as a modern movement, Jesse Binga's name should be part of that conversation. Not as a warning to stay away from it, but as proof of exactly how high it can go, and exactly how brutally a system can punish that success when it gets big enough to notice. He rarely gets mentioned in the same breath as the founders who get remembered for building lasting institutions. But what he built lasted for 2 decades under conditions most banks today will never have to face. No safety net, no bailout, and a city that bombed his house rather than let him quietly succeed. Jesse Binga built the first black-owned bank in the North with nothing but a pushcart and a plan, and for 2 decades he was untouchable, surviving bombings, a race riot, and a city that never wanted him to win. In the end, it wasn't his enemies who took him down. It was a depression he didn't cause, and a choice to protect his own community instead of foreclosing on it. Some people still call him a criminal who gambled with other people's money. Others call him a scapegoat, a man prosecuted for the same kind of risky lending that plenty of white bankers were doing at the exact same time without ever seeing the inside of a courtroom. So here's the real question. Was Jesse Binga a criminal, or was he a man punished for refusing to abandon the people who trusted him? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and if you found this story compelling, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Black Status for more deep dives into stories like this.